All right, good afternoon. Welcome to today's Planning Commission meeting. We'll get started with our first cases here in just a moment. Before we do, a little housekeeping and rundown on how we'll handle each case. We'll have staff present the cases to us. We'll have an opportunity to ask them questions before inviting the applicant up. Then they'll be able to share any other details they'd like to with us. We'll do public hearings for the cases today, and I'll mention when we open up the hearing for those specific cases. So if you're here from the public and want to weigh in, you can do that. We do ask keep your comments to 3 minutes or less in the interest of time. After that, we'll have the applicant back up for other questions, clarification, before having a discussion, making a decision, and moving on. Before we get started, any potential conflicts of interest today, commissioners? I have one that I'll mention, just let you all make a decision for 260 and 282 Leonard Street Northwest. One of the partners in that project is Indigo. I'm partnered with them on a different project elsewhere in the city, but I have no interest in this specific project, but felt that it was important to at least bring it up.
Do you have any knowledge about this project that we wouldn't otherwise have access to?
No.
Do you want to state whether you have any financial?
I have no financial interest or gain or loss for this project.
I'll make a motion that the chair does not have a conflict in this case.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, anything else? All right, then our first case is 260 and 282 Leonard Street Northwest. No? Don't even want to?
The applicant has submitted a request to postpone the application until March 9th. They are currently in the process of refining their plans, so unfortunately it's not ready for today, so they are seeking a little bit more time. Staff has no objection to that request.
I'll make a motion to postpone the case until March 9th to allow the refinement of plans. Oh.
Yeah, we can do
Right.
that. If you're here on that case and you want to weigh in, I'll open up the public hearing right now, and you can come share your thoughts. That will be in the record for the future as well. Close the public hearing and let
Now
you
I'll
make
make
your
the
motion.
motion.
Okay.
Second.
All right. Any discussion on that? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, motion passes. Then we have our zoning ordinance text amendment, floodplain overlay district.
Thank you. We're actually going to ask Mike Stahl from the engineering department. He will be taking the lead on this presentation. I gave a very broad overview during your lunch report. This project is very much a part of a larger project that the city is working on, and Mike could do a far better job explaining that.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, commissioners. As Kristen said, I am Mike Stahl. I work in the city's engineering department. So the item before you is to update the section 5.8.05, the floodplain overlay district. So the changes in this section include an update to the flood insurance rate maps that FEMA has just completed, and then is cleaning up some of the old language that FEMA no longer uses. So the FEMA is at the end of, well, at least for Kent County, they're at the end of this map modernization process. They've been working their way across the country, modernizing these maps. Our current maps were made in 1982, and the new maps will be effective 2023 now. So the changes largely are due to land use, new precipitation data, just updates in technology of modeling. Has changed a lot since 1982. The new flood insurance rate maps have the 100-year floodplains that are approximately 7% less than they were in 1982. In the Grand River, they're about 18% less area of floodplain than they were in 1982. The changes are needed because the city is a participating community in the National Flood Insurance Program, which enables property owners in the participating jurisdictions to purchase flood insurance through that program. So without the city's participation, flood insurance would be only available through private insurance carriers at rates that are described as extremely high. So our participation in the National Flood Insurance Program is conditioned upon our agreement between us and the federal government to adopt and enforce these floodplain management ordinance that reduce future flood risks. In turn, the federal government makes that flood insurance available to us. Earlier this week, City Commission adopted some changes to Chapter 32 of the city ordinance, and all changes to the city ordinance are needed before February 23 of 2023 in order to maintain the city's participation in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on this item.
All right, thank you. Commissioners, any questions?
Under the definitions of base flood, it says a flood having a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given area, as determined by whom?
Determined by FEMA, yeah. So it is a number of calculations that they use. They look at the hydrology, how much flow is going to come down the river. Then they put all that into a computer model, and then they run it, and they'll determine what area is inundated by the flood.
So a developer would not be calculating that and proposing.
These maps are generated by FEMA, and so then by them being adopted into the city code, that makes them the official maps that they have to use, and then only FEMA gets to then update them through their processes. So that is the official maps.
Thank you.
I should also just mention on that, people are allowed to submit requests to FEMA. If they ever think that their property is not in the floodplain, but FEMA does show that in the floodplain, the public is allowed to then submit a request with engineering documentation to say, I don't think I'm in the floodplain and this is why. And if they have solid engineering reasons why that property is not in the floodplain, then FEMA will change the maps accordingly.
If a situation like that were to happen, would this ordinance cover changes in the meantime? It's kind of, or would it require another update to our ordinance?
So the way that the code's written is adopts the maps by reference. So any changes then that FEMA makes are then included in there.
Are the rates between the private insurance and FEMA, is it double with the private insurance companies, or?
So the rates are generally going to be between the insurance company and depending on the property and what risks they are. Obviously, there's a number of risks that could incur, right? So typically, I think the National Flood Insurance Program insurance is about $700 a year. I don't have a feel for what the extremely high private insurance may be, but that's when talking with the state and federal officials, that's how the words that they use to describe it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll open up the public hearing. If you're here today about this, come on forward and share your thoughts with us. All right, then I'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, any other questions for staff? All right. We'll need a motion.
I can make a motion. Now, therefore, it be resolved that the Planning Commission approves the proposed text amendments to the zoning ordinance for the following reasons. The proposed amendments are consistent with the purpose and intent of the master plan and zoning ordinance because the proposed text amendment supports Objective 3 of the master plan to identify and preserve sensitive environmental resources and valued natural areas. The proposed amendments will enhance the functionality or character of the future development in the city because the amendment will assist in the reduction of flood losses and minimize the high costs associated with flood disaster areas in the city. The proposed amendment will protect the health, safety, and general welfare of the public because the required updates will help delineate areas in which potential flood losses may occur. The proposed amendments are needed to update the original text because these required updates will guarantee the city's continued participation in the NFIP program.
Support.
All right, we have motion and support.
Commissioner, I think what you meant to say is that you recommend to the city commission to approve the ordinance? In this particular case, an ordinance is you are a recommending body for an ordinance amendment.
Yes. Yep.
Thank
I
you.
am. Thanks.
All right, any other discussion? All those go ahead. Did you? Okay. All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion passes. Next case is 2160 Celebration Drive.
Okay, so the next case is a request for approval of a major amendment to the Celebration Village Planned Redevelopment District. Everyone is probably familiar with it. It's on the west side of the East Beltline, just north of Knapp. And the applicant is requesting this amendment to facilitate a project that wasn't originally anticipated in the approved planned redevelopment plan. The applicant is proposing the construction of a new 5-story mixed-use building with a ground floor commercial, covered parking, and up to 250 dwelling units. And because of the proposed changes to the plan, it does require Planning Commission consideration and City Commission approval. The PRD, just some background, the PRD grew out of the Northeast Beltline Joint Development Plan of 1998. The plan recommended a development in this location, such as was approved by the Celebration Village Development Plan. That was approved by the City Commission in May of 1999. So that exemplifies the intent of the Northeast Beltline Joint Development Plan to concentrate commercial development at a walkable pedestrian scale at this location. There have been, actually, I think I'll go to the plan here. There have been a number of amendments to the Celebration Village Development Plan since its inception. Recent relevant amendments include a 2020 amendment for a new 107 guest room hotel of 4 stories. That is in this area here. I don't believe they've begun construction yet, but that has been approved. There was originally a hotel was, that's not good. A hotel was originally anticipated on the subject site that we'll be talking about today, the Planning Commission recommended approval of a major amendment to relocate that hotel in a different site. So that was a major amendment. And there was also a recent major amendment for the site of the former Chili's restaurant that came to the Planning Commission last summer, and there was an amendment for 2 new buildings, and there'd be an urgent care there along with a coffee shop with outdoor seating. So because of the urgent care and the changes in the development plan, that also required a major amendment. So onto the subject property, it's about 3 acres in site, in 3 acres in area. There is an elevation increase of about 8 feet from the northeast to the southwest. I think I wrote drop in the staff report, but it's actually an increase. It's lower at the north than it is at the south. As you can see, it's currently all green space, and it was always anticipated to be a development site. Nothing has ever been constructed there save for the street parking along Celebration and Main Street and this drive along the eastern portion. Let's see here. Well, this is not good. I really want to, there we go.
Sorry, Tyler, do you want to go maybe pop in to see if Travis can assist? Sorry, Elizabeth.
Let's see here. The development site is the area that I'm pointing out on the screen here, just across Celebration. It's actually Celebration Drive from the movie theater. And it was originally anticipated for 2 buildings of 2 stories, mixed use, retail and office. Although the plan does indicate that a 4-story hotel is an option. We discussed that the hotel was built in a different location. So there's also a master deed agreement and reciprocal easement agreements throughout the development. We, as staff, do not have access to those. We do not have those agreements. The applicant has indicated, or the applicant's representative indicated that the project is an allowable use with the recorded master deed, and the project doesn't negatively impact any existing easements of record, although we haven't seen the REA or the master deed to confirm that. I'll just show you some Google Street View images so that we know what's around. This is coming in from the East Belt Line. We have the theater at the terminus of the street. On the right, where where my pointer is the subject site. Between that site and the East Belt Line is the former Chili's site. And then we have what the original plan identified as a 2-story building. As you can see, that's another change. That was constructed as a 1-story building plus a 3-story building at the corner. This is Celebration Drive, looking toward Knapp. We've got the IMAX Theater on the right side of the screen. There are shops and restaurants in front of a portion of the theater. And then at the corner of Main Street and Celebration is that 3-story building. On the left here is the subject site. This is that 3-story building, so it's 3 stories just at the corner there. And as you can see, it's brick, and then the other buildings are masonry. We've got the car wash on the far side of the site, and then sort of between the car wash and the theater in this area where I'm pointing is the general area the hotel is proposed. I'm going to close out of the presentation and reopen it. Oh, it's installing an Adobe update right now. Let's see if I can skirt around that.
Just hit OK. And mine was pretty quick today, so give it a shot.
I'm a little bit confused here. Apologies about the delay. Okay. Hopefully that was the problem. Okay. This is the existing conditions, and we've got the subject site. As I mentioned, there's the parking on the perimeter. This slide shows the proposed improvements on the site. The orange line is the extent of the building, and is the extent of the building. On the ground floor is covered parking of 85 spaces. I'm going to move on to the renderings to get a better idea of what's proposed there. So a 5-story building is proposed. This rendering shows that would be the south and the west elevation. The west elevation is facing the theater. And you can see the residential from the 2nd story and above. Ground floor, we have commercial space, particularly along the west elevation. On the south elevation, for a portion, we do have those storefront windows. The upper floors will be a mix of studio, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and 3-bedroom apartments. The final mix has yet to be decided. The applicant presented floor plans that show 232 dwelling units with the mix of units that I indicated in the staff report. However, the applicant is asking for the latitude of up to 250 dwelling units. Before I go on the elevations, I do want to mention density. Now, the original development plan and approved ordinance did not include residential as a permitted use or as a use on this parcel. Hence, today's public hearing for a major amendment. Because of that, I don't really have, there's no way to calculate density across the entire development. I did provide a density calculation for just the 3-acre site. That ends up being about 75 dwelling units per acre at 232 dwelling units. For comparison, the TNTBA and the TCC zone districts allow 58 dwelling units per acre. I want to reiterate, that does not take into, this 75 dwelling units per acre is strictly the subject, parcel, and doesn't take into account the full PRD, and I'm not even sure how many acres it is off the top of my head. So it would be much lower, of course, if we took the entire development into consideration. The building is being proposed appropriately relative to the exterior lot lines. It's oriented toward the abutting streets. We do have the commercial area at ground level with those entrances. So those types of elements are absolutely appropriate, for this type of development. A couple of the elevations that I do want to talk about, though, are this east elevation, and this is the interior drive between Hopcat and the former Chili's building, and this would be the access to the covered parking. So I just want to mention that the upper floors would be primarily what would be visible from the East Belt line, but this is the elevation that would be facing the East Belt line. The elevation at the right side is the north elevation that would face an internal drive and the existing car wash there. This is the south elevation, and we can see the continuation of those ground floor storefront windows and the upper level residential. We do have we do have a question that we'd like the applicant to address, because there does seem to be an inconsistency in this rendering and the proposed elevation. There are some garden units that I believe are taking advantage of the change of grade on that lower level. And if you look at the south elevation here, there does look like there's an additional row of windows. I believe these are the garden units plus four additional stories. So I believe there is an additional row of windows proposed on this elevation. That being said, those windows are still significantly above I think they're about maybe 7 feet high. And so I think the Planning Commission should really consider the appropriateness of this building elevation for this addition to the development. We do generally, for walkable neighborhoods, our TN neighborhoods, we want to see a significant amount of windows at the ground floor, and that's similar to what we would see on the opposite side of Main Street here. So we'd ask the Planning Commission to consider that, and I would ask that the applicant please address that issue. In general, we would ask that the Planning Commission consider especially the ground floor treatment all the way around the building to ensure it's compatible with what is desired in the development. relative to building height. As I previously mentioned, the original plan indicated 2 stories on the elevation that I'm looking at here. And then, let's see here. And then for the building that was originally proposed where I'm pointing on the screen, this was also proposed as 2 stories, but could be 4 stories if it were a hotel. So the Planning Commission should consider, those changes relative to the development plan. The theater was allowed to be 50 feet in height, with the IMAX portion up to 60 feet. The applicant's conceptual plan here proposes 5 stories and approximately 64 feet in height, although that could vary depending on the final plan. So consider the appropriateness of the height being proposed here. Relative to building materials, the original development doesn't specify any particular materials, although all the buildings were to go to Planning Commission for final site plan review. The Celebration Drive buildings and Main Street buildings are primarily brick, as you can see here, and masonry. The general PRD regulations in the zoning ordinance require buildings in PRDs be at least 75% brick, face brick, stone or cast stone. High quality materials on other exposed exterior surfaces are encouraged. This building is proposed to be metal panel as the primary material, glass, brick masonry, and concrete masonry. The colors that are shown on this rendering are what's proposed at this time, although that hasn't been finalized. So we'd ask that the Planning Commission consider if the proposed materials, specifically the metal panels, meet the PRD criteria for building materials, as well as whether they are appropriate relative to the remainder of the development. Relative to parking, this was a little tricky. The number of parking spaces in the Celebration Village was based on that proposed mix of retail, office, and theater uses. Residential wasn't included or contemplated. With that mix of uses, they reduced the parking requirement by about 28% of what was required at that time. Based on that complementary nature and the shared nature of the development. In the, let's see here, let me go. In the original development, a 182 parking surface, 182 space surface parking lot was proposed. And again, I think this would be something that we'd want to think about relative to the master deed and what was how the development was anticipated to work. With this open parking, even though it was probably primarily anticipated to support the adjacent buildings, other users could easily drive in there and park. With what's being proposed today, it is a covered parking lot that's has access from one side, and according to the application, the spaces are to be for residents and guests. So I don't really know how the master deed or REA, reciprocal easement agreements, address those things. So I think that would be something that we want to further explore. The proposal includes 163 parking spaces, 85 of which would be in that garage, and then there are those existing perimeter spaces and then additional perimeter spaces. So for a total of 163. Using the current requirements for PRDs for parking, which are the same as in our C districts, our auto-oriented districts. 333 parking spaces would be required for the proposed uses. Now, I used the C district because even though this is internally walkable, it's on the periphery of the city, and I would think that the nature of this general development is different than RTN districts. This is just a place to start, so feel free to modify, but that's what I did here. So I also used the mixed-use parking coefficient for the combination of residential and commercial uses. That it brought it down to 277 from 333. That still leaves a deficit of 114 spaces. Now, that could be addressed by shared parking within the development. However, I don't know at this time the details of that, and so I think that would be something that we'd want to further explore. I'd also like to add that this development is sort of the most recent in a string of significant changes to the development since its inception. So the Planning Commission may wish to require a parking demand study to be completed to determine whether adequate parking exists to support the use of a shared parking waiver here. I'm not going to dwell on bike parking. There's lots of bike parking proposed within that garage. To technically meet the parking reduction allowed for those micro units, there should be an enclosed bike storage room. That could be a condition of approval if the Planning Commission wishes to go that way. Relative to traffic, the applicant did have a traffic study completed, which has been reviewed by internally by the city, by Mobile GR. Has also been reviewed by MDOT, which has jurisdiction over the East Belt Line, as well as the Kent County Road Commission, which has jurisdiction over NAP in this area. The conclusion is that there will be some increased delays with this development, which could be addressed by signal timing changes. I don't know if we have, I don't see that our city representative is here, but he did provide a memo, which is in the packet. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. But at any rate, all three of the agencies agreed with the results of the study. Relative to stormwater, this has always been anticipated to be a development site, and it's accommodated in the existing stormwater infrastructure for the development. Standard engineering and stormwater and water quality requirements will apply to this, through the LUD's permitting process. Relative to signage, I do want to mention that I've made some modifications to what was in the packet after doing some further research. Just for ease, if the Planning Commission does make a recommendation, we recommend that you include the originally approved signage that would apply for this. It's a formula, 1.5 square feet per linear foot of street frontage. That would just make it easier, and they could always come back for a planned sign program if they wish. Lastly, I do want to mention neighborhood input. We have, let's see here, I wanted to just go to the building elevations. We received a letter from NECA, the Northeast Community Action Association. They support the addition of residential here. They have identified a couple of areas of concerns, parking and traffic circulation within Celebration development, access to and from the East Beltline, and the management of contaminated stormwater, which I mentioned the stormwater issues. We do have our stormwater project engineer if you do have questions. We do have another letter of support from Housing Next. They support this project due to the need for housing within walkable communities. We also received a letter and then an amendment to the letter from Bedmuller Realty Company, which represents entities neighboring the subject property. They own some of the buildings within the development, and they were part of the original. They were part of the original development group for this PRD. Their areas of concern are that the residential use was not originally contemplated, the proposed number of parking spaces is inadequate, green space is inadequate, the height of building is not appropriate, and they also just recently submitted an email that the proposed changes require approval from the co-owners of the condominium association and the Celebration Village developer, which I understand has not yet occurred. And I don't know if anyone is here to discuss that or not. But I think that speaks to the master deed issues. So in sum, we're looking at a new mixed-use building with up to 250 dwelling units. The Planning Commission is looking at a major amendment, and you should consider the appropriateness of this use and site changes on the PRD, potential parking impacts associated with the proposed uses at this location, whether a parking demand study should be completed prior to your making a formal recommendation, whether the ground floor building design is appropriate, whether it supports the pedestrian-oriented environment envisioned by the original development plan, whether the proposed materials are consistent with the existing and desired character of the development, and finally, whether the master deed and easement documents should be provided prior to your making any formal recommendation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Can you clarify something for me. You mentioned that the theater was limited to, I think you said 55 feet and then 60 feet for the IMAX. Was it limited to that, or was that just what they proposed at the time?
I'm not sure exactly.
So my question is, did the planning commission say, no, you can't go to 70 feet, you have to stay to 60 feet, or was it just what they proposed and then was approved at the time?
The plan here, it's actually on this page right here.
It does say maximum.
What's that?
I'm saying it does say maximum building heights.
So that was on the development plan, and I meant to try to measure those buildings before today's meeting, and it slipped my mind. So I don't know exactly how tall the IMAX is, but
And
that's
that
what was the
development
limit.
plan, the maximum building height, that was what was requested at the time by the developers. This document wasn't prepared by the city stating that this is the requirement. You have to be below this.
I see. This is the requirement because it's associated with the adopted ordinance.
Got it. Or adopted plan.
The plan,
It's
there's an
incorporated into the
ordinance that
ordinance.
references this plan.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's not to say that you still have the authority to recommend changes to
Right.
that.
Okay. Any other questions for staff?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the contaminated stormwater issue, could that be expanded upon in terms of the issues on this site or the development?
Good afternoon, Commission. My name is Dan Tabor. I'm a project engineer with the City of Grand Rapids, dealing with development reviews and permits and things like that. So this NAP area, the Celebration development as a whole, and then also the NAP's corner across the street goes to a regional pond. And that regional pond is not contaminated, but it's been impacted by salt. Overall, the issue in that whole general region is there's a lot of salt from parking lots, East Beltline, NAP, traffic. And the detention system that serves this whole region has been impacted by that salt. So over the years, the city and our partners with MDOT and things like that we put a new water main in the area because there were some wells and there were some concerns about taste and things like that. So that's been addressed, and overall, the city is working with regional partners to make modifications to that detention system. So that's what's going on in the region as a whole. This site specifically was always intended for development, so the system capacity is there to manage that. And this proposed development with the covered parking is honestly a preferable solution versus that large surface parking lot. That large surface parking lot, as approved, would have gotten a lot more salt. With this being a covered parking system, per city code and per building code, with it being covered, that internal drainage would actually go towards the sanitary sewer system and not the storm. Per building codes, we treat that basically car runoff goop from snow melt and things like that internal. That's not considered rainwater, so that would go to the sanitary sewer system where there's, approvals and processes and permits for that. All the parking garages downtown and things like that, it's a common practice. So as proposed, having a covered parking to a large surface parking is preferable from a water quality standpoint. And then also As approved originally, there was water quality treatment devices that handle the system as a region. But with the challenges we've had lately, the recent developments like the hotel and modifications to, I think it was the Chili building that's becoming the Med Center, we're also requiring on-site treatment as well. So it's handling what's on the site while, even before it gets to the bigger system. So through various overall city projects and individual policy changes and requirements for individual developments, those are being addressed.
Okay. Would this site also have to do the on-site
Yes.
treatment? Okay, thank you
Yes.
very much.
And with this being predominantly rooftop
Yeah,
and just some parking along the side streets, it's a lot less salt impact than as previously approved.
thank
And
you.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions or thoughts from a stormwater perspective? Or any other clarification?
I don't think so. Thanks, Dan.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions for staff, commissioners? All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Elizabeth or Kristen, in the text of the staff report, and specifically talking about height as well as building materials, it seems to say that the zoning ordinance does not allow for or requires certain things that they are asking for, changes in. Are those things that the planning commission is allowed to change then?
The planning commission does have latitude. The planning commission has allowed alternate materials, depending on the location.
Yeah, okay,
So-
thank you.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. I'll have the applicant up if they want to share additional details with us.
I'm going to be brief.
No, okay, go ahead.
Jack with Niederveld. Elizabeth and Dan stole all my thunder, so I'll keep it real brief. With regard to the parking, our client's been discussing the project with J.D. Lokes, who owns the property, and selling it to him. And his understanding is that that parking that you see to the northwest of our site is free for them to park in, and that's where any excess parking would happen for our use. So with regard to the building elevations and the facade and the materials, Ted Lott with Lot 3 Metz is here, and he'd be happy to discuss, the windows at the pedestrian level on the south elevation, the materials, that kind of stuff, if you have specific questions with regard to that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions then. Trying to figure out, come on up, Mr. Lott. The mentioned covered parking, I'm not able to determine based on the floor plans. Are all levels of parking covered, or is there an opening to the top level of parking?
So there's one level of parking, and it's fully covered.
Okay,
There's a courtyard in the building at the parking cover level that'll be an amenity space for tenants.
nice, okay. Can you clarify the question on garden level 1 and
Yeah,
how the elevations match up with it?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is ultimately we're in schematic design for the project and trying to figure out how some of this is working. I think that we're still evaluating whether we can fit those apartments in, both from a building code and from a functional standpoint. So we have some flexibility there to be able to address transparency concerns along that elevation if that's a concern of the Planning Commission. So I don't have any problem if you want to, specify a transparency requirement there. But as far as what that use is at that location, we're still figuring out, sizes of mechanical units, where they're going to go, how we're addressing amenity spaces, and then how we're addressing the retail requirements of the project, from the seller side. They have some square footage requirements they'd like us to hit. So that's just the variance in the plans right now, and that's the state of the project.
Can you talk about the need for the garden level? Was that, it looks like in terms of the change in grade. It's a foot maybe on that elevation. It's not much, but
Again, given the state of the project, we haven't fully come to terms with how the grades are going to affect these elevations. I mean, if you look at the elevations and the renderings, they're perceiving the building as primarily on flat land.
Right.
So, we're just not to that level of detail yet. I think the garden level was an idea about how we can get more housing into the site. Whether it's feasible or not, we're still working through. We've got some significant building code issues that we have to work through on that, and I'm just not sure it's going to work. So from a planning commission standpoint, it's either going to be housing, amenity space, or retail space. So it's not going to step outside the bounds of the uses we're talking about. And we certainly have the ability to be able to accommodate transparency concerns if you'd like us to do that. So I think that would be the way I would look at it as part of this discussion.
so if those were apartments, you're putting it at garden level 1, that gets them to that amenity level
Yeah.
courtyard?
Well, no, the courtyard is up at the
It's
second
even
level.
It's higher than that.
Yeah,
Okay.
so the courtyard is above the parking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just a weird split of the level 1.
And I mean, again, I feel like it's a question of where we are in the development of the project yet. We just don't have everything figured out.
Is that what accounts for the range in units?
Well, that's part of what accounts for the range of units, but it's also a question of us properly fitting what the developer feels is best to bring to market from the type of unit standpoint. So we're still working through that as well.
Yeah, that was going to be my question related to the flexibility in the number of units. Theoretically, it would have to fit in the same footprint as what you're proposing. And so I guess the logical conclusion would be that you would be getting rid of the larger units and adding more smaller
Well,
units.
I mean, that's certainly a possibility, but I think the location of this specifically suggests that more 3-bedroom units would be appropriate for this location, given where it is. So you'll notice in the breakdown of units that we have, I don't remember off the top of my head, I think 14 or 16 3-bedroom units, and that's been a focus of ours at this location. When we're doing projects closer to this location, we're much more focused on studios and 1-bedrooms. So it's a little bit, we're tweaking that mix a little bit. I don't, it's much more about us trying to anticipate what a market condition is rather than trying to cram more units in.
Okay. Could you talk more about the courtyard amenities? Because there's not a lot of other kind of green space proposed, like there aren't parks nearby for folks to,
Yep. So again, just the state of development, but that courtyard is anticipated to be a green amenity space for tenants. So outdoor gathering space, places for dogs to be, a park, if you will, an internal park. It's open to the sky, so it'll be open to the elements as well. But that's to be determined exactly how that works. But it's intended to be a place where tenants can go outside, on site.
Any other questions for the applicants?
Yeah, can you talk about the building material
Sure.
choices?
Sure.
And potential flexibility on
Yeah,
those?
so I think the thing that I look at when I look at a site like this as an architect is how very eclectic. I mean, this is strip mall culture out here, and there's all sorts of different materials, regardless of what was intended by the PRD, and there's all sorts of different architectural styles out there. So it's not a homogeneous condition, no matter how we want to look at it. So that's when we start to look at it, we start to look at trying just to create a proud, appropriate building for that environment, and that's what we feel we've done. To the specific materials, we're open to other suggestions as far as materials go, but I should say that the metal panel materials, as part of a PRD approval, you've approved as a planning commission on the west side for the Meyer project, for example. As part of that PRD, the office building on the north side of Meyer is one of our projects, and we're proposing the same metal panel here. So the planning commission has approved as part of a PRD that metal panel before. So But again, if there's a strong feeling about that, we can try to accommodate it. But I don't feel, I feel very differently about the way, kind of this the strip mall development is from, the way a city neighborhood would be as far as matching materials or trying to defer to something.
There's a quick mention about parking and potential for shared parking on that lot to the northwest. Can you talk about your perspective on a need for a parking demand study?
Well, I think, Kyle, you know how I'm going to answer a question about parking. I feel like this whole site is parking, to be quite honest. And then secondarily, no matter how we want to define the parking need of this site through a different zone classification, the parking provided here still falls within the bounds of what could be approved by staff for a 50% reduction. So we're within lines of intent for parking in other parts of the city, no matter what the zone classification would be. Given the fact that there's all sorts of adjacent parking around, if we needed to formalize an agreement, I suspect we could work on formalizing an agreement. I don't know what a parking study is going to share with us at this point, or what we're going to understand from that. It's not a neighborhood condition where we have, a significant density and a significant restriction on things like street parking, for example. I think it's also important to say that the overlap for these uses is going to be different as well. That we have commercial functions that are primarily going to be focused during the day when people are not at home at their apartments that are other places working. And that when people come to park at their apartment or at their home in this environment, they're going to be able to walk to the services on the site. I appreciate the fact that it's not intended as it's not a transit-oriented development or the idea of this is not a walkable community, but ultimately it is if we put housing here. These people can walk to any of the services, banks, restaurants, retail facilities that are right there on site. Even there's an Aldi's out here too, isn't there? So I mean, those are things that we aspire to as a community that we're able to take advantage of here. And I don't know that more parking solves that problem.
Did you or Jeff want to speak to the master deed questions that were raised through public comment?
Well, through public comment, or
Well, sorry, through the letter that was received.
well, I'm not quite. I don't quite know Mr. Muller's concern in this respect. But obviously, if there's condo association issues, that'll have to be worked out at the condo association level, and that, I mean, I don't think that should preclude a planning commission deciding whether this is appropriate or not. I don't know if, Jeff, do you have anything to add to a discussion about deed restrictions?
No, the only thing I would add is we're in the process.
Can you come up?
Would you mind coming up to the mic?
I agree that generally, of course, master deeds are civil, but I think it's helpful, given how this was developed, the fact that it is a planned development, having some sort of understanding that this development can work within those master deeds is helpful for the Planning Commission to understand.
Yeah, and we're currently reviewing that, and, both having legal and internally, just reviewing, making sure we're meeting everything that's required within there. Because ultimately, our goal is to create this development that fits in with all the other current uses. And so, I'm not prepared to speak on every single specific within there, but we are definitely addressing everything that's in the master deed.
Would you mind stating your name for the record? for us?
Jeff Royce.
Thank you. Other questions? All right, thank you.
Sure, thanks.
I'll open up the public hearing. If you're here today on this case and want to share some thoughts, please come forward, state your name, and we'll throw the timer on for you.
Good afternoon. My first name is Mark, last name is Ansara, A-N-S-A-R-A. I'm a partner at Advantage Commercial Real Estate, and I represent the Lokes family selling this property to the developers. Worked with the Lokes family for many, many years. They've always envisioned this to be a mixed-use development. They wanted to do it on their own for many, many years, but I think they've got their hands full on what's going on downtown right now. So they are working in conjunction with the developer and working together very closely on the building materials, the parking, the aesthetics of the property, and they're in very much full support of this project. And as far as the parking piece goes, I was also involved in selling the property for them a few years ago to the hotel that's going up right now. Those foundations are in, so that hotel is going vertical now. The Chili's there is down, and they're doing site work now as well, so there's a lot of activity going on as far as construction there. A couple of years ago when the Lokes modified their theaters and took out the smaller seats and put all the stadium seats, they have less seats now. So the parking requirements is much less. So we have been overly favorable to the developer and the hotel and neighboring tenants as far as cross-access easements for parking. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, I'll close the public hearing. Commissioners or staff, other questions for the applicant?
I think at the bottom of Elizabeth's staff report, I think she did a good job summarizing some of the areas that staff needed more clarity on. So if the Planning Commission feels comfortable, I think traffic and parking, making sure that the ground floor elevations, which I know Mr. Lott addressed, whether a parking demand study is required, and then, of course, just some clarity on the master deed, which sounds like it's in process. So I think that those were the key elements that we were seeking clarity on. So parking might be the only one that's outstanding in terms of technical aspects of the ordinance, in terms of what is provided and what is required. I can appreciate what this site looks like, from an aerial and the amount of service parking there. But in terms of whether there are rights to use that parking, whether a shared parking agreement is in place, bike parking, I think that that's still an item for the Planning Commission's consideration. In other words, I'm not sure I heard how they were going to earn the waiver of the reduction. So we do have the mixed-use coefficient, but then I believe that there was a remaining 114 spaces deficient, if I remember correctly. Some of that could be also accommodated through bike parking, but it seems to be implied that shared parking would satisfy the remaining per the ordinance. Again, that assumes that no other ordinance zone district parking requirement were utilized.
I do have one more question for the applicant, just for clarification. So looking at the rendering, all the white material, building facade material on floors 2 through 5, all of that cream or white colored material is metal paneling. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
intended to be a concealed fastener smooth panel of size to be determined. But again, it's the material we're envisioning is a dry design. It's called dry design. We used it on, like I said, the building to the north of the Meyer project on the west side.
Right, but not the entire facade is metal panel over there.
60 to 70% of it is.
Okay.
And we can, again, if there's a concern about materials, we can address that.
All right, if there aren't other questions, then we can discuss. I guess I'll start. I think it's a good mix of uses for this development. I think it'll be a really nice addition to the celebration. I think the applicant's statements about this being exactly what we want to see here probably is absolutely true, making this more of a walkable place when people can actually live here. I think we had some similar sentiments with the hotel and some of the other developments going around here. Just west, there's some higher density residential as well that I think supports the businesses here and in the end might reduce some of the auto-oriented demand that we have. I know it'll add people to this district, but maybe it'll reduce some of the people traveling into it if there's kind of a built-in customer base for all the businesses within the development. I don't have an interest in seeing the deed unless staff does, so I don't know that we need to require that. I think they can work that out, and it shouldn't weigh in our decision for whether this is an appropriate use or not. I'm glad that they're amenable to having the transparency on the south elevation, and I'm okay giving them some flexibility and not really knowing exactly what the use will be there, and I don't really care whether it's residential or amenity or whatever, retail. He didn't mention parking.
Well, it sounded like there was some building code issues, so I didn't know whether there was potential for the south side of the ground floor of the building could conceivably just be parking at some point, right?
So that's not the intent at this. I mean, the intent is to have that south facade be a contributing facade to the overall development. So we very specifically didn't want to put parking there.
Perfect.
Of course, this discussion may change that, may change what we need to do there, but we didn't want to. Certainly the direction we've been given from the seller, as well as they want that street to be as close to a retail street as possible.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to do.
And so you agree that as this elevation that's on the screen shows, this isn't contributing necessarily?
Well,
But
that's a different question, and we could argue about that, but the bigger point is that if you think it requires glass, we're happy to do it.
Okay. I don't feel super strongly about requiring a shared parking agreement. I guess if other commissioners want to see that, it sounds like the neighboring property owner is amenable to working something out with them, but I'm wishy-washy on it.
I appreciate that, but I think the ordinance is going to suggest that in order to reduce the parking, they have to earn that, and that can be earned through a variety of ways. And it sounds like shared parking might be one of the ways. So
They don't always require them to use all of the ways.
yes, we do.
Not all of the ways, not every time. They could choose 2 ways to reduce the parking requirement.
I see.
But not
Yes.
all 4 ways.
You are correct. We're saying the same thing, but they have to choose a way to reduce the parking. We can't just say you're absolved from earning those 114 spaces through one of the ways.
And since this is not public street parking that surrounds this, we can't necessarily just say there's an abundance of parking in the area.
Right.
I'm not going to dispute the abundance of parking in the area. I'm not sure what rights they have to that parking, and I don't know enough about the on-street parking to know whether those are shared, whether I don't believe that they would be dedicated or reserved for the development, but those likely could be considered similar to on-street parking, which is one of the waivers I think we could apply, presuming they're not dedicated.
I think the ones surrounding the site are like on the parcel itself were included in
In the count.
Elizabeth's calculations already.
I think for the sake of this discussion, we're happy to find a parking agreement as part
Great.
of this.
Thank you.
Okay?
One thing we didn't talk about was the covered bicycle parking and whether we need to require like room locked storage rather than just covered with an awning to meet the intent. I mean, I'm not sure that having a bunch of bicycle parking provided as part of this development actually does much, because other than biking around the development, you're not biking very many places from this location. It's not like you're biking to work from.
Sort
Give me
of.
a.
I think the parking thing for me is, I'm generally not in favor of adding more parking in developments as a rule, but this is not a downtown location, and this is 84 spaces for 250 apartments, essentially, right? Otherwise, you're walking 100 yards. And I guess I would disagree with the assertion that the uses are not conflicting from a time of use perspective, because when I go to a movie there, it's hard to find parking sometimes in that lot that is indicated as being shared here, but that's when, most likely, right? And this is the difference here is if I live in the core city, I may not have to own a car, whereas here, I think that's going to be almost necessary, right? It's not really, this village is walkable, but generally speaking, I don't think you can live, there's not very many transit options here to, right, so
across NAV,
yeah.
Agreed. I think we see this with PRDs fairly often, where they start out with unified control and then they sell off parcels, and then we're left to figure out how to force it to all work back together. So I'm not particularly worried about the parking situation, because I think they're all motivated to want to solve it together. But I do think we do need to document the actual plans. I say that particularly when some parking here now, I think, is going to be restricted to certain users. The village idea was set up that it would not be restricted. So therefore, I think we do want to see the agreements.
Would you be comfortable, though, with staff reviewing the agreements, or
Yes.
you as the planning commission?
Staff.
Okay.
I agree that the use, I think, is excellent as a village. The height, I'm not particularly worried about, given the height of the other buildings and the usage that it is. I think that's appropriate. I think the density works for me across the whole village, even if it's maybe excessive on the 3 acres compared to some part of our ordinance. But overall, I think I don't have any issue with that. The building materials aren't especially attractive to me, but I would definitely defer to the expert design team on that. Thanks.
Do you mean you want them to work with staff to make sure that high-quality materials are part of the plan, or that you defer to them to make the decision?
Thank you. I don't know why we couldn't just ask that the ordinance be met,
Sure.
which is 75% of materials be high quality brick, stone, whatever. And then there would be no question.
Yeah, since the ordinance was written, I think metal paneling has come a long way. We have routinely accepted metal paneling of this type to be considered equivalent, high quality, durable. It sounds like the architect is certainly willing to perhaps provide some additional materials, whether that's masonry at the base. Ted and I can work through that and duke it out if you'd like. I'm teasing, of course, but I'm sure that we can ask for some additional renderings to help add some additional material. But I'd be a little bit hesitant to say that the proposed material, the paneling, would not be considered high quality, because we have routinely accepted that.
Understood. And I appreciate the comments about how the whole thing has developed, and it is eclectic, but I don't see a lot of other metal panel there. I see a lot more attempts at brick, that's all.
Yeah.
But I would be very comfortable with staff working through that with the applicant.
Yeah, I echo those same agreements, just that the applicant is working with staff to use the highest quality materials, and then also having those parking agreements in place as well. Just because people that are staying here, yes, they can walk to the other facilities around there. I 100% agree with that, but just echoing Aaron's comments as well, commuting to work and other places, you need a car. So yeah, having those parking agreements in place, echo those agreements as well. But otherwise, I'm excited about this development. There's a ton of places around there, grocery stores, entertainment facilities as well. So yeah, I think it's a great use.
Yeah, I agree. I think the use is good here. definitely want to see more transparency on that south elevation, or at least breaking up that wall a bit, depending on how the final design works out. I'm a little concerned about the green space. Like, I understand that the final plans haven't come together for that courtyard and what it's going to be in terms of an amenity for the residents, but there really isn't anything walkable in that district as far as like recreational outdoor space. And so I guess I would just really encourage the applicant to consider that, I don't know, heavily when they're making their final plans, to make sure that they're providing something that will be an outdoor recreational amenity for the folks that will be living there, because they don't really have many other options in the area. But otherwise, I'm comfortable as long as the applicant is willing to work with staff to address the other things we've had concerns about. I can make a motion if we want.
All right, any other discussion before motion? Okay, go ahead.
All right. Now therefore be it resolved that the Planning Commission recommends approval of the request of Victory Development Group LLC for a major amendment to the Celebration Village Planned Redevelopment District to facilitate construction of a 5-story mixed-use building at 2160 Celebration Drive for the following reasons. The proposed use will meet the site plan review standards of Section 5.12.8.e because all elements of the design are harmoniously and efficiently organized in relation to topography, the size and type of lot, character of the neighborhood and adjoining property, and the type, size, and proportions of the buildings. The mix of uses, density of development, and design of the proposed PRD are consistent with the master plan and purpose and intent of the zoning ordinance because the addition of residential use supports the master plan recommendation for mixed-use centers that incorporate housing, shopping, jobs, and services. The proposed PRD amendment will ensure efficient development on the property and will result in a logical and orderly development pattern in the neighborhood because the proposed building siting and design respect and are consistent with surrounding and desired development. The proposed development will be compatible, harmonious, and appropriate with the existing or planned character and uses of the neighborhood and adjacent properties because the addition of residential will enhance the vitality of the development. The proposed building design and materials meet the characteristics important in planned redevelopment districts, and the project maintains the neighborhood's unique character, enhances its walkable scale, and reinforces its sense of place. Potentially adverse effects arising from the proposed development on the neighborhood and adjacent properties will be minimized through the provision of adequate parking and documentation of shared parking agreements, attractive architecture and appropriate building orientation entrances, and thoughtful pedestrian and vehicular connections. The proposed development will not be detrimental, hazardous, or disturbing to the existing or future adjacent uses or to the public welfare by reason of excessive traffic or noise, because the uses are not anticipated to result in significant increased traffic, and the proposed building will incorporate adequate transparency and facade variation. Connections among buildings, uses, and amenities within the property will be provided via existing driveways and new and existing sidewalks. Adequate public or private infrastructure and services already exist or will be provided at no additional public cost and will safeguard the health, safety, and general welfare of the public because all stormwater associated with this development will meet requirements for detention and water quality. The proposed development will not be detrimental to the financial stability and economic welfare of the city because the project will result in improved vitality within the development, and the development will result in additional tax revenue. Wherever practicable, the proposed development will provide amenities, including but not limited to park and recreational facilities, urban open space, and non-vehicular connections that serve a public purpose, because the development will include an interior courtyard for use by residents. Be it further resolved that the following conditions of approval shall apply to this project. Standard condition set A, approvals. Were those already read or not? No? Sweet. All right. One, that the application and plans submitted by the applicant and signed, dated, and stamped by the planning director shall constitute the approved plans, except if plan elements do not meet ordinance requirements and are as amended in this resolution. That the use shall operate according to the application and per testimony as recorded in the planning commission minutes. That this approval does not include any proposed signs, and any future signs shall be subject to the requirements of Article 15 of the ordinance and permits received prior to installation. That a land use development services or LUDS permit, building permit, and all other required permits be obtained from the city of Grand Rapids prior to construction, demolition, or operation, that the proposed use will comply with all other applicable city ordinances and policies and all state laws. Also, that the site be permitted the 25 square foot ground sign specified in the original development plan, and that each tenant be permitted wall signage of 1.5 square feet per 1 linear foot of street frontage with a limit of 1 sign per tenant, with modifications permitted via plan sign program amendment. That the south building elevation shall be modified to incorporate additional transparency, landscaping, or other methods to mitigate lack of transparency through working with the planning department. That a portion of the proposed garage parking, I don't know about that one. I'm not going to do that one. All right, that the master deed.
Would you like the
Yes,
shared parking
please.
agreement be
Thank you.
provided to the planning director prior to the issuance of the LUDS permit?
Yes, incorporate that. What is staff's recommendation about the master deed related to going before city commission?
Looking at you, Mike. I think we're in concurrence that the master deed is a civil matter, and so it's really the responsibility of the development team to have that resolved and for them to work it out.
Okay. Then, lastly, that this approval shall take effect upon city commission approval, unless Kristen has another recommendation that I missed.
I don't know if you missed it as much as you mentioned the south elevation, and what I heard the conversation was that the south building elevation be modified to incorporate additional transparency, period.
Okay. I didn't know, based on the fact that they didn't have all of their plans done, if we should allow for additional flexibility with your approval, but.
Well, that would still give me flexibility.
Okay.
But just that the expectation is that there's transparency added to the extent possible.
Fantastic. Please incorporate those modifications to that condition.
And then another item I heard that I didn't hear you state was that the elevations include additional building materials to closer align with the building element requirements of the zoning ordinance.
Thank you, yes. That concludes my motion.
Second.
All right, do we have any discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Our next case is 802 Bridge Street Northwest.
The next item for consideration is 802 Bridge Street Northwest. This property is in the TN TBA Zone District. The request is to establish a property management office at the ground floor of the building. The ordinance requires that any location within 20 feet of a front line abutting a neighborhood business street is required to ask for special land use approval for ground floor office use. The property is surrounded to the north with an apartment building, and there's a vacant lot. It's medium-density residential. Also to the east, there's a two-family residential home. Directly to the south is a single-family home, and to the west is a TBA zone district, which the building in that location is an event planning and floral design shop. The master plan identifies this area, the future land use map, as medium low density residential use. This is in the West Side Area Specific Plan established in 2015, identifying the area as a traditional mixed neighborhood. So on this slide, you can see the property location is surrounded by what's identified as medium low density to the north, traditional business area to the east, and it's west of the neighborhood center at the center point of Bridge and Stocking. And the red area is the traditional business area, which includes the greatest intensity of use, more retail shops, more restaurants, a higher intensity of use. As you travel west towards the location in question, there are more homes and businesses and institutions coexist. And so the intensity of use diminishes as you travel west. In this area, it's expected to respect the historical storefront character of buildings, and it's encouraged to maintain a vertical mix of uses. The building on this site is, as you can see, it does have a vertical mix of uses. It exists with that ground floor office space, and upstairs is a 2-bedroom residential apartment. There are currently there's a building permit and a land use development permit in process for this application. So the extent of this consideration today by Planning Commission is limited to the use. Any building or site plan issues can be identified and addressed by staff at the permit level. For the use of this building, they're expecting to have 2 full-time employees that will work in the office Monday through Thursday, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., traditional business hours. There's an expectation that there will be weekly meetings and daily meetings with additional staff. And so additional staff may come and go. In regards to parking, whenever change of use occurs, we have to consider the parking requirements. In this case, based on the previous use of this building, the parking requirement was higher than this proposed use. As a result, a parking waiver is not necessary. There is parking available on site as well as on the street, and it's on a major transit route. There's bus stops on the street and across the street. In sum, key considerations by Planning Commission today would be the appropriateness of the use at this location and any neighborhood concerns that are expressed in this public hearing. I should say that the applicant had submitted to us copies of a description of the project that was given to the adjacent neighbors, and we have a signature of acknowledgement from them. And a letter of support has been received by JBAN.
All right, thank you. Commissioners, any questions for staff? All right, thanks. I'll invite the applicant up. Is there additional information you want to share with us?
I don't have any information. Good.
Well, then, any questions for the applicant? None right now? Well, then, I'll open up the public hearing. And I'll close the public hearing. Anything?
No, I think this use in this location is completely appropriate just based on how the corridor kind of moves from business into residential. I think this is a fine transition into that part of the corridor. And based on the fact that they have LUDs and building permits in process, yeah, all the exterior stuff that I would have questions about will be handled through that process. So I'm completely comfortable with this application.
Me too.
Okay. Great.
I think that that's true, and I think in the way that that street goes, but even in particular, that this location is at the edge of the TBA where it intersects both LDR and MDR. And that matters to me because the whole idea behind TBA is to have commercial working together. But this being on the edge, I believe it would be appropriate because it's at the edge.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the apartment above is going to stay too, that they're maintaining that vertical mix as well. Does anyone want to make a motion, or do you want me? I feel like I jump in.
You've been
too
doing a great
fast.
job with this, so if we want to keep that rolling.
Do you want to give your first one?
No, I'm
Okay.
great. Pass that along to you.
All right, here we go. Now therefore be it resolved that the Planning Commission approves the special land use request of RSB Properties of GR LLC Ross S. Bacon to establish a property management office on the ground floor at 802 Bridge Street Northwest for the following reasons. The proposed use will be consistent with the purpose and intent of the master plan and zoning ordinance, including the zone district. Because the proposed use will support the West Side area specific plans designation as a traditional mixed neighborhood by retaining a combination of both residential and non-residential uses. The proposed use will meet the site plan review standards of section 5.12.8.e because the proposed on-site paved parking area and landscape improvements will bring the site closer to conformity with zoning ordinance requirements, and access is immediately available to sidewalks along each street. The proposed use will be compatible, harmonious, and appropriate with the character and uses of the neighborhood, adjacent properties, and the natural environment because they will support the desired mixed-use character of the neighborhood. The proposed use will not have adverse effects on the neighborhood because the existing building is appropriately positioned on the site and is consistent with the requirements of the TNTBA zone district, and both on-site street parking and transit are available. The proposed use will not be detrimental, hazardous, or disturbing to existing or future uses or to the public welfare by reason of excessive traffic noise or visual clutter, because anticipated office traffic will generally be low, consisting primarily of employees. The proposed use will not adversely affect the walkability of the neighborhood, impair pedestrian circulation patterns, disrupt the continuity of the urban street wall, or hinder the creation of a pedestrian-oriented environment, because the arrangement of the proposed building and site are intended to encourage an active street environment. The proposed use will not be detrimental to the financial stability and/or economic welfare of the city, because this use is not anticipated to create nuisances or needs that will require additional city services. Be it further resolved that the following conditions of approval shall apply to this project. Standard conditions at A, approvals, which I recently read, and that concludes my motion. Oh, I guess I didn't read, what was it? Condition 5 and, or 7? No. Oh, okay. I'll read condition 5, that any expansion of the approved special land use requires an additional special land use review and approval by the Planning Commission, and 7, that this approval shall take effect 16 calendar days after the date of the Planning Commission's decision.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, that motion passes. Thank you. All right, next we have a presentation on our master plan process.
Thank you. So I'm going to pass out a couple of things for you. So we wanted to provide the Planning Commission with a brief status update. This is just an informal update because of the timing and a few other issues that I wanted Planning Commission concurrence on specific to the selected or recommended area-specific plan. There are, if you remember the scope of services, there are actually formal report outs that we will have with the planning consultant. So those are still planned. However, I think it was a good time for kind of that mid-cycle break for us to bring to you a couple of announcements. The first is that part of our round one engagement, which is getting to know the community, understanding the priorities, we are having what we call launch parties. There is one in each ward, although it is not specific to the ward, meaning if you live in Ward 1, you could attend the Ward 2 launch party, but we wanted to make sure that it was convenient for our community. So I'm going to pass out some to each of you. Please take as many as you'd like. We have a lot more. that I'd ask that you share with your respective networks. The launch parties will take place on February 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Those dates were felt to be convenient, and the time that was selected was 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. So all of this information I'm presenting to you was vetted through the steering committee, had a lot of input on not only the locations, but also the time of the event, the fact that it is a family-friendly event. We will not have separate childcare, but there will be activities for children, so you can bring your child, have them participate in some sort of activity that will be useful through this process, while parents or guardians would then participate in the actual, both the presentation and the tasks. The steering committee also did vet the tasks or the activities that will be taking place that evening, and we've incorporated their feedback, meaning we've made the changes that were felt that needed to be made. So these are what we call the launch parties. So they're the first public engagement piece that the community would see for this project. Running concurrent with this is a virtual option. So if you are not able to attend the actual launch party, you will be able to participate or fill out the information on a website. And so that information is obviously all here as well. Separate from the launch party engagement activity, recall that we do have a variety of public engagement strategies for this process. Remember that we know we had disproportionate participation in our community in the 2002 master plan, and those that have been routinely marginalized in our community did not participate, meaning their voices were not incorporated into the process nor incorporated into the recommendations. And so there's been a lot of concern about whether the outcomes of the O2 master plan benefited our entire community. And so we have created a neighborhood, what we call our Community Connector program. We've run something very similar through both the GR Forward plan. We ran it something similar when we started this process through our neighborhood facilitation program, where we have paid I want to say sponsorships, paid positions for the 20, I believe it's 21 community connectors. Along with the community connectors, there are 11 neighborhood association or organizations that are also going to serve in a very similar capacity. So overall, 21 plus 11, we've got 32 groups or individuals that will be launching these community conversations. So that process will be running alongside the launch parties. We will we're training the community connectors. We're providing them with a meeting in the box. We're providing them with that facilitation training and looking to them to lead within their respective networks to achieve the activities that we are looking to get the feedback that we're looking for. These positions are not paid as like salary positions. It's intended to support individuals that are already active within our community, to supplement the work that they're already doing. And of course, any of the overhead costs like the print materials and such, that all comes in the meeting in the box. There's also money that we think should be available that can be used for food, for example. If they were to hold a party or a meeting in their backyard, they could then provide snacks with that funding as well. So that's a couple of the strategies that we're utilizing within the first round of the engagement process. You'll note that on top of these little sheets, you can see the brand that was selected from the steering committee. So the brand or the project itself, the process, I should say, is branded as A Bridge to Our Future. And you can see all of the future design elements associated with this process. And I'm distinguishing that from the project because the project itself may or may not have a different brand, a different feel to it. But this is the process that we've got with this color. I can't speak to all the other things that good marketing had associated with describing this, but you'll see that this is what all of our communications and emails and websites would look like throughout this entire process from start to finish. So any questions on the launch parties, the round one engagement work?
I guess my question, and maybe you can answer this or city attorney, what role should we play in the launch parties and future engagement events, if any, how engaged should we be, or are we observing?
Nope, you can be fully engaged. So the enabling legislation does allow for subcommittees of the Planning Commission. So it's not a conflict of interest for you to participate in this process and then vote on the project, if that's sort of where you were going for. Yep, so Paul, for example, is your liaison to the steering committee. He is allowed to provide input and fully engage with the steering committee, but then also be a voice through this decision-making process.
Is that, when we get to area-specific plans specifically, is that also the case? That we can be engaged in those? I mean, I think in the past, we tried to kind of stay out of it.
So you can be engaged, but I see we have similar challenges where, we try to take a bit of a back seat because we do have the decision-making or this perceived authority within the community on all things planning. We really want the community to lead these conversations, but I think it certainly helps to have individuals like yourselves or staff provide some additional structure or just some pushback, because you've got a lot of great experience that can be used throughout this process. And your feedback on the area-specific planning, for example, will be critical. Any other questions on that? Okay. All of the presentation material and information that we provide is both provided in English and in Spanish. We are hoping that we would have translators that would have the ability to speak other languages at the meeting. Unfortunately, it's not feasible for us to provide all of the information in multiple or more than those two languages. So we did have to make a difficult decision that we will only do it in English and Spanish at this time. However, that's not to say in the future that the final plan itself couldn't be translated into another language should monies be available. So the second task that we have, Elizabeth, is there a PowerPoint that Leila gave us? No? Okay, I thought she emailed. I have it on my screen, but I'll just use it to guide my conversations. So you may recall, as part of the request for proposal, we included the...
I was just going to say, if you can save it somewhere, I can open it, put it in the PC graphics folder, and I can open it up.
Oh, okay. No, we have Facebook.
Just Facebook.
Elizabeth, I'm sorry, Planning Commission, what is the next one? Commission meeting graphics, there it is. And then you're in 2023.
Or somewhere else, anywhere that's easy.
Okay, there, it just popped up.
So we'll be able to have our people share any social media things on ours. Not that you have a much bigger following than we do, but if we could do those reciprocal kind of sharing things for engagement events especially.
I'm too old for this. I don't know. I know the planning department doesn't have an Instagram, but I believe the city does.
Yes, they do.
It's different age demographics when you're talking about social media.
Yeah.
Go back out one file, Elizabeth, one level. That's where I saved it.
Oh, right here.
Thank you. Oh dear. It wants me to close it. There we go.
No, I don't want to sign in. Gosh.
Use the view only. Just use the view only.
Yeah, I just wanted to, oh my gosh, I just wanted to close out.
Now you know why we don't have Instagram, right?
There we go. Here you go. I'll let you fix that.
All right, so as I was saying, you may recall that part of the request for proposal, we had in there that we wanted to complete 3 area-specific plans. I believe we currently have 11 adopted area-specific plans and a few other planning documents that help guide some decision-making. And so our goal was to provide 3 plans as part of this process. The Creston Neighborhood Association was predetermined several years ago, probably back in 17 or 18. Creston was asking for one. And at that time, the planning department said, we're just about to start a master plan. We can't, please don't embark upon an area-specific plan because these things do need to align. We can work on this. Obviously, we had some significant staffing transitions immediately thereafter and then the pandemic. So unfortunately, that we're about to start it, took a few years. So we did want to hold to our commitment, which is why the Creston neighborhood was pre-selected. So the goal of the RFP or of the planning department was to pick one area-specific plan per ward. So obviously that was the second ward. Ward 1 was then considered, and Ward 3. I know you know what an area-specific plan is, but just sort of to tee up the presentation, we really wanted that fine-grained neighborhood level or district level process that I hope and you find very valuable in your planning decisions that you make routinely. So for Ward 1, we did vet these ideas with the, we did vet these ideas with the steering committee. These ideas came out of conversations with both staff, where we're seeing a lot of either development pressure or uncertainty in the planning commission or staff's decision for how should we treat this. The general master plan sometimes doesn't give us a whole lot of guidance for certain areas of the city. So it's really challenging when we have investors or development groups come in and say, well, what does the city want to see? It feels a little bit uncertain for staff to provide that feedback when we don't have that unified vision or that the ownership in that vision itself. So for Ward 1, there was 2 areas that were considered. One was considered like that North Front Street. So think of Front Street on the west side of the river, somewhere between 6th Street and Ann Street. Those were the general boundaries. And then we also considered the Butterworth area. I'm saying area because these actual finite boundaries or the defined boundaries will be part of the process. What does Butterworth area mean? We know, of course, it would follow Butterworth, but how far in? Does it go 1 block? Does it go 2 blocks? Does it go 2 parcels? So that level of detail is still to be determined. That will be vetted as part of this process. Ultimately, Butterworth was felt to be the best recommendation to the Planning Commission. The reasons for that is we've got a lot of development opportunity. It's a mismatch of uses. There's industrial with the Coke plant. We've got Padnos. We've got some residential. We've got some little commercial nodes. It's just a really intriguing area with no defined vision for it. And of course, then there's the downtown campus for Grand Valley University. One of the things that sticks out to me that the steering committee said was, when we were selecting Front Street versus Butterworth, it was like, okay, Front Street's Front Street, right? That's commercial businesses. They're pretty stable. Heights are probably the obvious. What do we do with this? Or is, the 3-story or 5 stories okay still? But Butterworth, people live there. And so as we see development pressure increase in Butterworth, it's only going to be natural for us to have the concerns about gentrification and displacement. And there are pockets or areas of lower income and lower household values. So there's a lot of change that could take place and not change for the better. And so I think really looking at that area of the city will be a benefit to us as we start to see changes happen in that location. So that was for Ward 1. Here's the general boundary that you can see in yellow. Again, that's not defined, but intended to follow along the Butterworth Street.
Just a note on that. I know that it's not defined yet. The way it's drawn, though, it does cut off before you get to the Coke plant and some of the other larger parcels to the west. So I think it makes sense to take it to the zoo, probably.
I agree.
The southern boundary of the zoo.
Yep, I would agree. Thank you for catching that. Ward 2, as I mentioned, I already covered this, that it would be the Creston neighborhood. There might be additional funding through the Corridor Improvement Authority. That remains to be seen. We are confident that we can give Creston a useful land use plan. But if there's elements that they would like to embark upon, such as a retail study, those might be additions that they could afford to do that will help guide some of their investments. But they could also do that at a later date. So we're meeting with them within the next few weeks to better understand what resources they may or may not have to be part of this process. Here's the general boundaries. We know that Plainfield itself is changing fairly significantly. So we know that we want to, this is the neighborhood, of course, that's showing in yellow, the neighborhood association boundaries, or neighborhood boundaries. But there's good connections to the river, a lot of opportunities on Plainfield. And then there's a lot of traditional residential development. So making sure that we have the right mix of uses, understanding that there's a need for a parking hold line, all of those good planning reasons make Creston a good candidate for an area-specific plan. Ward 3 is a little bit more difficult to describe, but we do have a large number of Planning Commission cases that come before you. We have the business area-specific plan, which obviously was focused on the businesses itself, the Corridor Improvement Authorities, business associations that are within the 3rd Ward. We have a lot of opportunities for infill development with vacant lots. And then we also think that through these planning processes, we're able to educate and increase capacity and build leadership within these communities. And so we think that that could be a benefit, an outcome that we would all benefit from as well. If we think about the Southtown neighborhoods, think of it like the donut around the business area specific plan. So all of those residential areas that were not really considered or planned for as part of our business area specific plan, we know that as we see new investments and new developments happening on the business corridor, that is going to cause development pressure internally into the neighborhoods, I mean. And so there are concerns about what, as we see rising property values, we then see issues or concerns about displacement and gentrification. And so we want to make sure that we're managing that to the best that we can. And there might be other tools through these processes that could be identified that would also help. Oh, yeah, and we know right now with the way the current ordinance is structured, if we don't do a better job of planning in some of these areas that are ripe for impact, right now our ordinance is set up to allow multifamily for 90 feet of lot width. Well, 90 feet is probably 2 to 3 lots. And so it's a quick acquisition that can then displace people. But we also lose existing structures, and our existing structures tend to be our most affordable housing stock. So we want to make sure that we're understanding how our current policies and future policies are impacting these neighborhoods. And then the maps sort of show where that proposed area-specific plan would be. I don't think this does a great job, but if you think about those corridors on the within the business area specific, think of the donut or the inverse of that. So those are the 3 areas that we've chosen. Are there any questions, especially on Ward 1 or Ward 3? Oh, I should say that for Ward 3, we did also consider 28th Street. We did look at whether the corridor could benefit from having an area-specific plan or some sort of corridor plan. I think the answer is yes, but perhaps not the same level of priority that we feel the neighborhoods have for the 3rd Ward. So all in all, this is the recommendation from the steering committee. And then also Planning Department does strongly support this. And I'm looking for the Planning Commission's concurrence, that you feel comfortable with the ones that are selected. And I don't know, Paul, if you have anything more to add.
Excuse me, I was just going to ask you to reflect on some of the questions that I heard from the steering committee so that you can educate us on these questions. One was why are we doing these at all? I thought we were doing a master plan.
Yeah.
And then the other version of that was, why aren't we doing this everywhere? right? So maybe you could equip us with how to answer that.
Yeah. So why are we doing these? I would say because we find them extremely valuable, and I hope the planning, I think you do as well. Having that neighborhood level plan and understanding, what are the boundaries of residential versus commercial, or where should that parking hold line be, for example. Those are extremely specific decisions or recommendations within the plan that we can use with our decisions. It's also a very good tool for staff. So when we are meeting with developers and investors, the area-specific plans tend to have a level of detail that is very easy for us to communicate. This is what the community wants. There's ownership in this. They all support this, generally speaking. This is the tool that the Planning Commission would use. I think that the value of those plans are benefit staff, but they also benefit the development community. So investors are looking to determine whether to make a go at a project. Having that certainty and that unified vision established for them really gives a greater level of comfort to say, yeah, okay, there still might be a process and there's still engagement that needs to be happening on a project-specific level, but having that unified vision, I think, provides that certainty that we know what we want, and it gives us the ability through other projects, Vital Streets, for example. We can look at our area-specific plans when we're making decisions through our Vital Streets plans about how those two interact. The second question was, why not everywhere? Well, one of my answers would be, of course, resources. These take a tremendous amount of engagement at a neighborhood level, more focused and intentional, detailed questions that need to be looked at or data that needs to be looked at. And also, quite frankly, I'm not sure that every area of the city needs one. And I know sometimes that feels like, what do you mean we don't need one? We need a plan. Well, when you look at some of the neighborhoods that we have, they're fully intact. We're not seeing a lot of development pressure. There aren't a lot of transitions that are that we're expecting or that would be obvious. And there's not a lot of, large swaths of open land for that development to take place. And so it's oftentimes not always necessary to get to the level of an area-specific plan that the master plan couldn't already cover. So if we think of some neighborhoods on the far northwest side, we don't see a lot of infill development happening because it's largely established. There are pockets, of course, like 960 Bristol, for example. There are pockets of open areas where we do see projects, but that in and of itself wouldn't warrant a neighborhood level plan. So where we see large areas of the city already intact, it doesn't make sense to spend the time and the money, because I think what we see today is probably what most people that are there want to see tomorrow. Also, I think where we see the most development pressure is closer geographically to either our industrial areas and or our commercial areas, because that's where we see the most transitions happening. Also, those are where our transit lines are, so we have greater level of impact that could happen with transit-oriented development. So any objections to the areas that are being recommended? They make sense to you as well? Okay, perfect. That's what I needed to know.
Do you need a verbal concurrence?
I concur.
Good. It's great. Thank you. All right. I'll open up the public comment portion of the meeting and close that. Any other business? All right. We're adjourned.